So briefly talk about the need for the plan, and then also a brief review of the process, just to put this all in context. And then the meat of the discussion is going to be about the modifications we made from the pilot to the expansion to the full CCE. And then lastly, the results of the CCE Whitebark and Limber Pine restoration strategy. Okay, need for restoration. Is that little thing showing on, I don't know, sorry. Move over. Okay. So why do we need restoration planning? Back in 2016, in the strategic conservation framework that the CMP did, they identified whitebark pine as one of their conservation priorities. And the reason they did that is because the Crown of the Continent ecosystem has, unfortunately, the highest mortality rate of whitebark pine anywhere within the range of the species. Places have over 90% mortality. There's been a lot of research you can see there on the left that shows how high our mortality is for both whitebark and limber pine. I can't say definitively it's the highest mortality of limber pine, but if not, it's close. So we have a lot of mortality, and it's been identified as a need for restoration planning. So back in 2016, our Hi5 working group was formed with that mission that Carl was talking about to protect and restore functional whitebark and limber pine ecosystems in the CCE. And we identified several challenges. The two that are pertinent to the discussion today are the jurisdictional complexity and the lack of formal means of coordination, and then also the need to prioritize our restoration investments because we have such limited resources. So the multi-stakeholder group that was there, I think 58 different groups were represented at that meeting, was to establish our Hi5 working group, which obviously we did, and we're doing amazing stuff. And then also for the prioritizing restoration investments, we need to develop and implement a Crown-wide restoration strategy and action plan for both whitebark and limber pine. Excuse me. Okay, jurisdictional complexity. The Crown of the Continent is 18 million acres, the Crown of the Continent ecosystem. It's one of North America's most ecologically intact ecosystems, but it's very jurisdictionally complex. It crosses an international boundary, has one state, two provinces, and it's administered by a host of different federal, provincial, state, tribal, and First Nations governments, along with private lands. And each one of those has their own missions and mandates and capacities for work that vary greatly. So we knew that we couldn't bite that whole thing off at once and write a plan for that larger area for two species. So we decided to do a pilot study where we would just, we would come up with a process, and we would only do it for one species, and that was whitebark pine. And we chose that because we chose these 3 units because they represented the breadth of the diversity of our jurisdictions, and also whitebark pine because we had so much information on whitebark pine. So it was Glacier Park, Flathead National Forest, and the Flathead Indian Reservation were the 3 jurisdictions. So this is as much as I'm going to go into the process. I'm showing you the 6 steps. Some of you, I'm sure, are tired of seeing this slide, but step 1, first identify where the species is capable of existing. That sounds, simple, but it was, we had to wrap our heads around where does this even apply to? So we had to identify the species potential range. And then within that area, where it had the highest conservation value, where it was the most important to restore it. And then in step 3, we identified and quantified the threats and stressors affecting whitebark pine. And we used those threats and stressors in step 4 to quantify the restoration action's likelihood of success. So how do the threats and stressors affect how likely the treatment will be to be successful? I'll talk about that a bit more later on. Step 5, and this is National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan direction, is to identify 20 to 30% of your potential range as core areas for restoration focus. And then the final step, and this is the 2B part of that Diana was talking about, is to actually assign restoration actions and to develop a plan. And that is actually what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. That's step 6 after lunch. Elliot Meyer and I will do a PowerPoint and also GIS demo on the how the Flathead developed a 10-year plan. So just a quick overview of the accomplishments we've made related to this topic. So we completed the pilot for Whitebark Pine back in September of 2019. The Flathead completed their implementation plan based on the pilot results in July of this year. And then the CCE scale Whitebark and Limber Pine restoration strategy, I say completed October 2021. We're still like wrapping it up, but it's for all intents and purposes is completed. We've been busy. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the modifications to the pilot process that we made for the CCE scale strategy. One of the things we did was we added cultural uses to the ecosystem services, and I'll explain that here in just a minute, what ecosystem services is. And we also added climate change to the biological capability factors. In the pilot, we used climate change only as a stressor in step 3 and 4, and we didn't use it in step 2 in the biological capability factor. So those were 2 changes that we made, and I'm going to explain those right now. So conservation value, one of you might ask what that means. It means it's either currently providing ecosystem services or capable of providing ecosystem services in the future. So what are the ecosystem services, you might ask? The technical team for the pilot identified those as wildlife food source, which grizzly bear habitat was given additional weight. Also watershed protection and municipal or impaired watersheds were given extra weight. Recreational or educational values were given various weights. And let me point out there where the asterisk is that for ecosystem services jurisdictions, each of the jurisdictions was allowed to assign their own weights, and this was to be reflective of those different missions and mandates. So for example, the park had a weight of 30, where the National Forest and the CSKT lands had lower weights for recreation. And then the highlighted in, or the red font there, the cultural uses were added after the pilot. And so the tribal lands had obviously is where they were weighted for cultural uses, and they had up to 50 weight for some of those areas. And then the biological capability factors, the asterisk down there, weights are common to all jurisdictions. So these were not allowed to vary by jurisdiction. We only had one set of weights for these. So comb production was given various weights depending on the amount of canopy cover represented. Rust resistance was given a high weight there, obviously. And overall, the biological capability factors got higher weights than the ecosystem. Biophysical characteristics this is really, we called it comb production potential, and a couple other little things went into it, but it's basically where whitebark can survive and grow the best, was given additional weight, and then also places where we'd had recent burns, because we knew that's where we wanted to do planting or could potentially get natural regen. Those got additional weight. And we added persistence under future climate to the CCE-wide strategy. It was not in the pilot in this portion. And you might think that those are lower weights. And the reason is because of the uncertainty of climate modeling. And we had a couple different models, and where it was predicted under both models, it got a 20, and where it was predicted only under one model, it got a 10. And this is an example. This is Whitefish Mountain Resort that Carl was referring to earlier. You see that it got really high conservation value. That's because it's a recreation area. It has plus trees, It's a municipal watershed, you know, it had a lot of the things that add additional weight. And so that's why that area is has such high conservation value. Just a quick example. Okay, so the next thing that we did differently was we further refined the whitebark pine population definition with emphasis on genetic diversity and evolutionarily stable populations. This is kind of a big deal. Okay, so we really, and those of you were at the meeting where we talked about connectivity and distribution a couple of years ago, how to consider it. We wrestled with this. We wrestled with this a long time, trying to figure out, because both the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan and the Fish and Wildlife Service say when you're doing a restoration planning, you need to consider connectivity and distribution. And in the CCE, we've had such high mortality. Most of our whitebark is scattered trees, you know, along ridge tops. We have a few stands, but really most of our population is pretty scattered. So we were asking ourselves, what is it that needs to be connected and well distributed? Is it those individual trees we have? Do they have to be clumps? Do we need stands? Or is it something bigger that needs to be connected? And what we came up with was, the answer was populations. So what's a population? And we define that for our uses. And I've been working with Anna Shuttle and Jessica Wright on a paper we're writing, where a lot of this stuff came from. Anyway, I'll just jump into it. Our definition of a population is a minimum of 10 acres with at least 50 trees per acre at maturity, but our target is equal to or greater than 100 acres with 50 trees per acre. So as small as 10, but really what we want is 100-acre populations. The minimum effective population is 100, and now this is based on some work that Frankham did with the 100-1,000 rule, where 100 effective population gives you genetic stability for 5 generations. Whereas 1,000 gives you an evolutionarily stable population in perpetuity. So our minimum is 100 effective population size, and then some work by Hoban says, and others say that about 0.2% of a census population, so that's all the individuals as your census population, you can count about 20% of those as your effective population. Has to do with genetic and being related to each other and such. So, so you need at least 500 individuals to have get those 100 of effective population, and that's where our 10 acres at 50 trees per acre comes. But to have an evolutionarily stable population, you need 1,000 effective population, and that's where our 100 trees with 50 trees per acre comes in. So hopefully that made sense to everybody. If not, please, we can discuss it. And also, the genetic diversity is a huge deal that I think we all need to emphasize more. So the recommendation is if you're planting, you need at least 20 mother trees in your 10-acre areas. But if you're planting 100 acres or more, you need at least 60 mother trees and preferably 100. And I know that sounds like a lot, but as we share seeds and collect from more trees, I think it's going to become more and more, not easy, but it'll become more practical. And then also one of our recommendations is, you know, if you have a 100-acre area, don't plant it all in one year. If you don't have enough mother trees, plant some and then do more collections and then come back and plant with other mother trees in the same area. So split that area up into 35-acre groups. Okay. Another population definition criteria is that populations need to be within 12 kilometers of each other. That has to do with the distance that nutcrackers can be reasonably expected to fly and cache seeds. And to be actually within a specific population, you need to be within 1 kilometer. So if you have if you have individual trees, if they're within 1 kilometer of the population, they can be considered part of the population. And that also has to do with nutcracker, very common flight distance, and pollen sharing and such. And this is an example. We're going to talk about this afternoon, but you can see here, these are the planting areas in the Flatheads, the North Fork of the Flathead area in the 10-year plan. And you can see how those are our priority 1 and 2 plantings, and they're all within, that's a 12-kilometer grid there. And the plantings are all within 12 kilometers of each other, and all at least 10 acres in size. But most of them are 100. Okay. So the next change that we made to the CCE scale strategy was we added limber pine. And adding limber pine brought a lot of new challenges. I'm so glad that it's done, but it added a lot of time and effort into the process, because limber pine does not have nearly as much information as whitebark pine, and we really struggled with limber pine. One of the things we found out, we knew that whitebark and limber had ties with different types of soils, and it seems that limber pine is more strongly related to soil type than whitebark is, calcareous limestone kind of soils. And if we had had some really great soil mapping across the entire CCE, that would have been extremely helpful to use in our limber pine mapping, but we didn't have that. We only had that for a few areas. And so we couldn't really use soils. So we had to do some maximum entropy modeling, which I'll talk about here in a minute. Anyway, when we added limber pine, it added a whole lot of new challenges, but we got it done. And the last thing that was different in the CCE scale was we added the ability to compare core areas at an analysis area scale. Because in the pilot, we had individual jurisdictions having different weights, and also we didn't have common data layers across the entire area because we were using the best information each jurisdiction had. Because of those things, we couldn't compare our core areas across the entire pilot analysis area. We could only look at them relative to within the jurisdiction. And that was a critique of the pilot. And we came up with a way in the CCE scale strategy that we can compare core areas relatively across the entire CCE. So this is a little bit about what I just said, the comparable data layers that we have in the CCE wide. Therefore, the data is less refined. So in the pilot, the data that we used was probably a little more, Joe came up with that word, refined. You can't really say accurate necessarily, but as you go to a broader scale, the level of refinement of your data, you lose it as you go bigger and bigger because you have to compromise to common data sets. And so again, our conservation value is calculated with only biological capability factors. So you see the ecosystem services there on the left and the biological capability factors on the right. Boom. For the CCE scale relative core area value, we took out those ecosystem services weights and only used the biological capability factor weights. And some people would say that we shouldn't consider ecosystem services anyway, that we should take human value kind of stuff completely out of it. So if that's how you feel, then the CCE scale analysis did that. So a little background that I think everybody needs pertinent to these topics is this CCE, the whitebark pine potential and predicted range, because we're talking about core areas. And so what are core areas? Well, core areas are the potential range, which is there on your right for whitebark, plus the likelihood of treatment success. So if there was no likelihood of treatment success of any of the treatments, those get removed from the core areas. So that didn't happen in a whole lot of places, but we did lose some of the potential range because there was no likelihood of treatment success when we changed to core areas. So where did this potential range come from, you might ask? With whitebark, there was a lot of work done before we started the pilot. There were already 4 existing habitat models for whitebark that we used in the pilot. And then we also had quite a bit of existing plot and tree data. So we used both of those in the pilot, but in the CCE wide, because we had to use maximum entropy modeling for limber pine because we didn't have any habitat models, and our plot data was pretty skewed, that we had a lot of plots in some areas and basically no plots in other areas. We had to use maximum entropy modeling. So we use that in combination with those existing models and existing data for whitebark. And Joe, please jump in and correct me if I said any of that wrong, because you know much better than I.
You're doing great.
Oh, yay. Okay. And just to show you, we also created a layer called predicted range, which is where we predict that the species is currently existing, and that's the darker area there. So we have potential range, which is in the pink, and then the predicted range where we think the species currently exist in the darker color. And you can see for whitebark, there a lot of the potential range is predicted to have trees in it right now. And here's the same thing for limber pine, the potential and predicted range. So here it was completely created by maximum entropy modeling and the existing plot and tree data. There were no habitat models existing that we could use. And you can see here that it is quite a bit different than whitebark in that where we predict it's currently existing is a much smaller portion of the predicted or the potential range, sorry. Christy Cleaver can see that dark area where she's done a lot of plots down there. And that's a good thing you've been there, Christy, because we think there's a lot of limber pine there.
Melissa, I was just going to pop in and say there were some existing models in Alberton. And then I think there was one that we worked with in BC, but certainly on the US side, there was nothing from the start. So
thank you so much for filling in that. Okay, Alberta and BC had some existing habitat models that we used for that limber pine stuff. Okay. So another thing that you need to understand, because likelihood of treatment success plays in here, like I said, in developing core areas. Our likelihood of treatment success, as I said, it was based on the effects of stressors. And those stressors were blister rust, beetles, succession fire, and climate change. We had a heck of a time figuring out how to incorporate stressors in the pilot process, but Anna Shuttle came up with an amazing table that we used. Part of the issue is that stressors can have both positive and negative effects. For example, in a high rust area, great place to go and look for plus trees, but not such a great place to plant. Whereas in a high fire area, that's a great place to plant, but a really poor place to look for plus trees. Anyway, so we created these likelihood of treatment success tables that you will see in my plenary talk tomorrow, a more detailed discussion of, but we developed them for a host of different treatments there that you can see on the left. Planting, direct seeding, mechanical treatments, which is basically thinning with heavy equipment, or hand thinning, daylighting, removing competition immediately around the tree, prescribed burning, and cone collection. And so Joe is going to do a demo of some of our likelihood of treatment success layers, just so you can see what they look like. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay. Let me know when you can see that.
I can see it.
Great. So like we said, we've done this for both whitebark pine and limber pine, but just for efficiency's sake, just gonna focus on whitebark for the demo here. What you're seeing is just the potential range, and that's sort of the limiting factor when we develop these products is we model them out to the potential range of each species. So let's turn that off. Like Melissa was saying, you've got your threats and stressors, and those can be, both positive and negative. And each of those was essentially a geospatial layer across the board. So for succession, we used percent of canopy cover across the range. This is a remote sensing based model, and then a very high percent canopy might be a bad place for, say, planting, but be a positive for thinning or daylighting. So that's how some of these stressors can be both positive or negative. So recent burns, let's see, Path Mountain Pine Beetle. And we were able to develop these using consistent data across the entire CCE. You'll notice here that I have both the CCE boundary, but for our model, for all of our data, we modeled it out an extra 16 kilometers or 10 miles past the boundary, just so that we could, accurately capture the data at the boundaries as well. So when you run the threats and stressors through the sort of the process that we did, we ended up with geospatial layers that identify our probability of treatment success, where it's poor is red, neutral would be there's neither positive or negative things to indicate that that's a good or bad area to go. Good is the light green and very good is the dark green. So very good would be where we had overlap of three or three or more stressors that are positive. And then the poor is anywhere you had at least one stressor that was negative. So thinning and daylighting would be great for the areas where you've got high succession, but maybe not so useful in areas where you had recent burns. So that's what thinning and daylighting looks like at the CCU scale. Prescription fire, obviously you can see the effect of those recent burns, areas that have burned fairly significantly in the past. Not so great for doing fire prescriptions, planting, mechanical, and cone collecting. And then the next step beyond that is we added access limitations to each of these. So for example, you can't go very far from the road to do mechanical treatments. So we can look at that same likelihood of treatment success with that access limitation on there, and you can see significant amounts of the range disappear, at least for mechanical, because it's limited by distance from roads. For the access limited version here, I've gone red is poor still, neutral is that same green, but then good is light blue and very good is dark blue, just so you can see how that access limitation also reduces where you can apply treatments. I don't know if there's anywhere you want me to zoom in, Melissa, or if you think that's sufficient.
I think that was really, that was good to show how the access limits, especially with mechanical, affect things a lot, and just wanted to mention that we did not limit access anywhere in the process until we got to this likelihood of treatment success layer. So, so when we were looking at things like conservation value and such across the entire area, none of it, we didn't limit anything by wilderness, for example, or, you know, difficult access. We looked at, when we did conservation value in core areas, we did not limit that. We know where all of the most important places to treat are. And then we didn't, then we added these access limitations here at the likelihood of treatment success, the treatment layer. But no, Joe, I think that was great. Does anybody have any questions on that or want to see anything in more detail? Okay. All right. Thanks, Joe.
Yep.
Okay. So now I'm going to talk about this difference, this core areas at 2 scales between the CCE and the jurisdiction in a little more detail. So as I mentioned, we use those comparable or consistent data layers that were less refined than the pilot layers. And we use that conservation value at the CCE scale that was based only on biological capability factor weights. And then the jurisdictional was based on both biological capability and ecosystem services weights. So our core areas equal the highest conservation value areas plus at least 1 treatment with a positive likelihood of treatment success. And our target, as I mentioned, is 20 to 30% of the potential range that will be in core areas. So one of the things we had to do was break our analysis area into groups. There's so many jurisdictions, as you saw earlier, and we needed to do the analysis, as I said, at these 2 different scales, the CCE scale and jurisdiction scale. Well, what is a jurisdiction? And these are the groups that we came up with. There's 19 of them. Each one of the tribes and First Nations were a separate group. And then Alberta was broken into 3, provincial, protected, and other, as was BC. And we have the BLM, then some of the tribes, the DNRC is separate, Glacier Park is separate, Montana, other, some more tribes there, the Nature Conservancy, the Forest Service is 1 jurisdictional group, and then the Waterton Lakes National Park is a group. So those are our 19 groups that the jurisdictional analysis is being done on. And here are the results of the core areas at the 2 different scales. You see the jurisdictions there on the left and the total potential range acres. So remember, everything that we do is bounded by that potential range. So within the CCE scale, you can see there that we were shooting for 30% in the CCE scale core areas. But overall, but when you look at the individual jurisdictions, they are definitely not 30%, right? Because this analysis is not done at the jurisdictional scale. It's done at the CCE scale here in this middle column. So we were shooting for 30% at the CCE scale, but it varied quite a bit depending on which jurisdiction group you were in, whether or not you got 30% also. So Alberta other got a significantly lower than 30%, but places like, let's see, the BC provincial protected, and I could try and get a pointer here.
Hey, Melissa?
Yeah.
Yeah, a person's raised their hand in the chat. Nina raised her hand. Maybe a question?
You want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Sure, it's Mike Bruce at NINAP. Yeah, just following through the whole conversation, and I was just talking to Kenzie Fox, our KEPA coordinator director in Kainai. I don't know if we've gone and did a survey with Whitebark and the Nutcracker. We only have just a small allotment that we call timber limits. That's just adjacent to the Waterton Park, and I don't know. This the mountain area we have is of high elevation to have whitebark pine. We need to check it out, but I just had a quick conversation text-wise with Kanzi. We've not gone in there, and I don't think it's high enough to have whitebark pine as the other regions adjacent to the mountains in Waterton National Park. So just wanted to comment on that. Just to explain the NA.
Right,
all the way
right.
through. Yeah. So
Thank you.
yeah. So just very quick explanation. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And when we get to the limber pine, it will probably be a different story. So yes, you can see if that NA, that means that they had no areas identified as core areas. Sorry guys, let me see if I can move, oops. Grab this thing without, well, perhaps I can't. It won't let me move it anywhere, maybe there. Okay, apologize for that. So bottom line is that when we're looking at 30% at the CCE scale here, that means that each jurisdiction is probably not going to have 30%. They're going to have something other than that, depending on how they were relatively across the rated across the CCE scale. But then, okay. But then over here in the jurisdictional scale, we were shooting for 30% in each jurisdiction. Now, depending on where those weights classes broke, we couldn't get, we were trying to get in the high 20s-ish was what Joe was shooting for. And so sometimes when there were not, and if there were small acreages, especially, it was difficult to break it right at a certain percentage. So that's why they're not all very close to 30%. But that was the goal that we were looking for, was the high 20s. And so you can see the CCE scale, variable by jurisdiction. At the jurisdiction scale, they are all in the 20 to 30% range, except for for example, the Nature Conservancy, they only had 102 acres. And so so the majority of that was rated as being in a core area, just because you couldn't really break that out. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move on, I think. Let's see if I can, there we go. Okay, does anybody know how to make this thing go away?
You're stuck with it forever. I don't know. I'm not sure.
I am so sorry. I don't know where to put it to get it out of the way.
Oh, are you talking about the laser, or because
no, I'm talking about the this bar.
Oh, we don't see that. That's
oh good.
Yeah, that's not
I keep moving it around, but okay, let me see if I can get rid of that. Okay. Well, anyway, sorry. Now I've got the laser too. So here are the whitebark pine core areas, and on the left is the potential range that bounds everything. In the middle are the CCE scale core areas with just the biological capability weights. And on the right-hand side are the jurisdictional scale core areas with both ecosystem services weights and biological capability factor weights. And you can see, I have to hit enter now, that in this example, and Joe's going to show us some live examples, but this is just a clip I did. And you can see that for the most part, at least in this specific area, it didn't change a lot. It changed more, it went from high to very high, the darker green on the right-hand side. There's, you know, more of that than there is darker blue on the left-hand side. For the most part, though, the core areas were very similar in this area. But places where, and so, yeah, so here versus here. But places where there were higher ecosystem services weights, it did make more of a difference. And we'll look at that here in just a little bit. So here are the limber pine core areas. And again, we were trying to shoot for 30%, but 35% is what we got for limber pine because those weights did not break very well at the places we needed them to. So for limber pine core areas at the CCE scale, we have 35%. Again, it varies then by jurisdiction. There's the Kainai. They have 305 acres of core areas for limber pine in the CCE wide and 737 in the jurisdictional scale. And then when you get to the jurisdictional level, again, we were trying to shoot for 30% by jurisdiction, which comes out to about 27% of the entire core area. And here are the limber pine results, potential range on the left, core areas at the CCE scale in blue in the center, and then in green at the jurisdictional scale on the right. And again, little insets where you can see that core areas did change a bit, but more just the good to very good rating changed in this area. So Joe's going to do a GIS demo comparing those CCE and jurisdictional scale core areas. Not much difference for some areas, bigger difference where the ecosystem services weights are high. And then I'd like to open it up to the group while Joe's showing this. Think about, you know, we have not yet decided how to use the CCE versus jurisdictional scale information. In our tech team, we've talked about it that, you know, well, I won't even go into that right now. Just while you're looking at this demo, be thinking about the difference between the CCE scale and jurisdictional scale core areas. And when you're doing your restoration planning, how you would use each of them differently. So go ahead, Joe, and take it away.
Okay. So I'm going to start with a zoomed out view here just to show how those biophysical capability scores kind of play out across the range. And this is what was used for the CCE scale core areas. And then we also have a similar thing for ecosystem services, but you can see, you know, depending on what's happening, here's that big mountain, or the whitefish, where you've got, I think it's within a future climate, and there is some plus trees and some good genetic diversity, and there's a number of things that recommend that as a good area for restoration. So that is how the scores kind of play out. And then what we did was we tried to take, you know, the highest 30% of area to get core areas. And then ecosystem services, again, that's, you know, that plays out kind of differently. You can see down here in the CSKT land, you get some higher values due to cultural uses. And then for the demo, we're going to start here in Waterton because if you recall, with Melissa's table, at the CCE scale, almost 60% of Waterton's potential range ended up being considered core area, just based on the highest conservation values across the entire CCE. So these are in black are our core area polygons, and then these are the highest CV1 would be the very best areas, and CV2 would be second best in terms of conservation value. But then when you do the jurisdiction specific analysis, you're including in that ecosystem services, but at least in the case of Waterton, you're also really trying to hit that 20 to 30%. So where this was 60% of the range of the CCE scale, when you throw the jurisdiction specific ones up there, you're dropping back quite a bit in terms of overall area. And I think that is where, in Waterton at least, where most of the change came. The actual CV values don't seem to differ too much, but you're definitely getting, some differences, but really the major change in Waterton is simply due to trying to hit that jurisdictional 30% as opposed to the CCE scale, which is irrespective of jurisdiction. So that's Waterton, where you had a pretty significant change between the two.
So Joe, could I just add that?
Yeah.
So for example, in Waterton, if 60% of their potential range is rated as high at the CCE scale, I mean, that's great information that Waterton's a really important place to restore, likely because of all that fire that they recently had at the CCE scale. But knowing that 60% of your potential range needs to be restored is not that great of information, because that's more than you can bite off, right? So then knowing at the jurisdiction scale that this is my highest 30% within my potential range is probably more important when they're doing their planning, to know where their highest 30% is. And then in general, knowing that, yes, we have a higher priority within the CCE, but you can see the value of the two different scales of, and that how important the jurisdictional scale is when you're actually implementing planning in your jurisdiction. Okay, take it away, Joe.
Thanks. Then we wanted to show an example where things haven't changed as significantly. So if we cross the border here into Glacier National Park, at the CCE scale, I think somewhere in the range of 30% of the potential range in Glacier ended up being in the CCE scale core area. And then when we did the jurisdiction specific, we aimed for that 30% as well. So you don't get as much of a change, and there's a lot of overlap between the two. You can see there are some differences, but it's not nearly as dramatic as in Waterton. What you do see here in Glacier, I think, is a change in where those very high and high conservation values are, just specific to or due to where those ecosystem services weights are. So a lot of this is driven by recreation, distance from a road or a trail, and grizzly bear habitat. And then also, I think there is somewhere in here, kind of does this shape here, there's a higher priority watershed that's captured up in here, I think. So while the overall area isn't changing much, between the jurisdiction and CCE, you can see where like the high value versus good versus very good do change.
That was a great example, Joe. Thank you.
Great. Anything else before I?
Yeah, does anybody else want to see their specific area or before Joe stops sharing his screen? Okay.
Great.
So after that amazing demonstration, and you guys can get a feel for the product that we have there, I wanted to throw it open to the group to talk about how we can use those two different jurisdiction scales. What thoughts do people have about, if they were going to start doing implementation planning, how would they think about those two different scales of information when they're deciding where to do their treatments? And I will go ahead and throw that open, and if people don't have anything immediately, I can throw out a few thoughts, but I didn't want to bias anybody's thoughts. I would like to throw it open to the group before I say anything. And I will wait 15 seconds. So jump on in. Just unmute your speaker if you would like to say something. Okay, well, I'll throw out a few things that we were thinking about as the tech team. Well, maybe, there we go. So one of the things, and we're going to be talking about this afternoon, something we call treatment focus areas. So when we go and begin to plan treatments, we actually come up with spots where we are going to focus treatments, because if you look at the entire core area, especially because of populations, and wanting to group populations and spread them 12 kilometers apart, but also because of treatment efficiency and some places are better than others to do treatments, we created these treatment focus areas. And that was one thought, that we could use the jurisdictional core areas to look at where we focus our treatments, but then we could also overlay the CCE and just make sure that we weren't missing some things, especially if we needed areas for connectivity or something, that we also looked at the CCE scale when we were identifying treatment focus areas. Another thing that we thought of was we could add them to the treatment prioritization process. So we have different categories for how we choose a priority treatment, whether we give it a priority 1 or a priority 5, say, for example. And if it's in both the CCE and the jurisdictional core areas, perhaps it could get additional weight versus if it was just in the jurisdictional core area. And then the other thing we thought about was especially along that buffer area, when you're planning for your jurisdiction, to be looking on the borders, because we need to have connectivity across all borders. And we could look at the CCE scale core areas when we're looking from border to border. And then, will we do a plan at the CCE scale implementation plan? Right now, that's not really part of what we've been talking about. We've been talking about the individual jurisdictions doing their prioritization. And so for now, we're talking about emphasizing the jurisdiction scale core areas and then supplementing with the CCE scale. But if other people have thoughts on how we can use that CCE scale information, we are open to them. And any thoughts that came up while I was talking about that? I realize this is a difficult venue to have an open dialogue and group discussion. So, I understand why people aren't necessarily chiming in. I bet there's a lot of really good thoughts out there. And we are going to have, we are going to schedule.
I see Lynn's got her hand raised.
Oh, good. Let me just finish that thought and then Lynn, you can jump in. We are going to schedule a wrap-up meeting for this CCE-wide strategy in hopefully in late October. And if folks have thoughts and want to join in, this is going to be one of the topics we talk about at that meeting. So go ahead, Lynn.
Thanks, Melissa. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I just wanted to thank the team. It's amazing work and it's so awesome to see this all pulled together. And I'm excited to have everyone use this. On your feedback on the use of these various skills, I think what you said, and I really support what you just said, and I'll just rephrase it, that the CCE-wide scale can be, and I think should be used to provide context for when you're prioritizing specifically for your area of the CCE. And not necessarily use it to prioritize, but just provide you context in case it does give you or cause you to change what you might do because of what you're seeing at the larger scales. So just more of the same what you said.
Thank you. I like that better, the context part. Good input. Thank you, Lynn. Anybody else have thoughts? Okay.
Actually,
sorry.
Oh, no, sorry, I was late.
That's okay, go ahead.
Thank you. No, I'm absolutely just stunned and amazed. It's such beautiful, complex work, and I'm so grateful to you and all the members of the team for your vision and commitment and really clear thinking at every step of the way. It's just a wonderful model. I wish we had this for all of the values that everyone has agreed to work on collaboratively. I guess the one thought I had actually was, we started off today hearing about the really, superb on the ground work by so many different jurisdictions to plant seedlings and collect seeds from mother or plus trees. It occurs to me that it might also be helpful to have some kind of a map that really combines the two. I don't know if that's possible, or just at least shares where all the on the ground work is happening so that people can consider that in the same way that they consider the context in the way that Lynn was just describing.
That's a really good point. We do have, we do consider past and proposed treatments when we're doing our implementation planning. We do have that information as one of our data layers, but it, of course, it's already outdated. It doesn't have those things that people were talking about today that they'd accomplished. So, so that would be one thing we would need to do. We would need to consider is, somehow tracking those updates to treatments. But they are considered in implementation planning. But it's a good point that that they need to be, and that we're already out of date.
Hey, Melissa, it's Lynn. Could this be, Anne, thank you very much. Could this be a new project that the working group pulls together? This could be part of, I think, some of maybe the inventory monitoring working group, where we can start creating and populating a database that we can draw from, and a map layer that depicts the work that people are doing related to these different treatments that you have outlined in here, that they either have proposed or are doing or have done.
I think that would be a fantastic task for the inventory and monitoring group. It would be very valuable information to have.
Yeah, something to talk about this afternoon from the subcommittee group then.
Yep. Any other wonderful thoughts? Okay. Getting close to wrapping up here, folks. I'm sure it's getting close to noon. So how to share the strategy products, all these wonderful products that you've been seeing today. We have a committee, some folks have volunteered to decide which layers need to be shared. Certainly not all the layers need to be shared, but things like core areas and likelihood of treatment success layers and comb production layers and such, those things are pretty obvious. But there might be a few others that we think of that need to be shared. We do have confidential information, mining information, cultural uses information that we cannot share. So we need to make sure that we respect those commitments. And so one of the questions is, do we share the information at the CCE scale, or would it be more useful for people to have just their jurisdiction scale information sent to them? And the jurisdiction scale does include the border, the 10-mile buffer, I should say. Would it be too overwhelming to send the CCE scale information out, or perhaps we would have it at both scales available? And sorry, Joe. Lynn, you had something?
I'm wondering if we could dump all of this on our science space. I mean, we've got our place where we put all of our Crown data, and then organize it there by the CC scale and jurisdiction scale, and people can pull off what they need from there. Is that something that we can do, Natalie? Or is that not something we want to do?
That would be more of a Phil question, I guess. I've never worked with the science base.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that we can, and that's actually where all of the Crown Managers Partnership data sets are. And we can put it there, and with all the other metadata associated with it, so you can pull it off there. So we don't have to be sending it out and finding a server for this large data set and then fulfilling requests when people ask them. They can just go there and grab what they want.
Joe, did you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think my only thought, I'm happy to do whatever, but my biggest thought is, if we're setting out the geospatial information, presumably a geospatial person is going to pull it and then do whatever they need to do to get it prepared for their jurisdiction. So I would think you would just send out provide everything at the CCE, and then they can clip as appropriate and reproject as appropriate and organize as appropriate. But however we decide it is fine.
You were breaking up just a little bit on my end. So were you saying just put it out at the CCE scale, assuming that GIS, people with GIS expertise could pull it and just clip their information out if they didn't want the CCE scale stuff?
Yeah, that's my thought, is that if someone's pulling the geospatial data, then they're I would think at least competent in working with the geospatial data to properly prepare it for their jurisdiction.
Okay.
But again, I'd be happy to do whatever. If it makes sense to have everything at the jurisdiction level, we can do that.
Hey, Joe, what would it take for us to have a platform for this where it's more of a click and go thing, like they just click on and off, and so that a person without the GIS skills can go to a web server and say that, they're on the CSKT and they just, they want to see the CCCE scale, and they click on that, or they want to see their jurisdiction, and they can click on those and turn on and off things. Is that possible to create? And I know that that's a big workload. I'm just saying, is that possible?
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're talking about would be like a story map online, like a hosted web map where you can, have information and metadata and a story associated with it, but also a map that you can interact with. It is a big workload. I think probably the bigger issue is going to be who would host that data. I know it's pretty complex for us to both develop a story map and then get it publicly hosted on the Forest Service side. So I don't know like who would host that product, but yeah, I think that would be sort of the ideal for non-geospatial people to access it, or even anyone to access it just through a web link.
Right.
We have a sort of a lo-fi product that we were gonna demo in just a second. That's not nearly as useful as a web map, but I agree that would be great. I think there's a technical complexity there with hosting though.
So I'm wondering if we should flag this, Natalie, as something, I don't know, Joe, GTAC might be, the Forest Service through GTAC might be able to host that, because they're hosting a bunch of other story maps. We might be able to get someone there to do it, or they might be able to find a intern to pull it together. The hard part about this, even if you find someone, it's pulling in again more of your time, Joe, to help them understand the information to create it. So that's a workload for you, but I think that's something we might explore if people are interested, or in putting that on the table of things.
So thanks, Lynn, because that was our last topic. Do we need a non-GIS format for sharing info? And so we do have some Zoomable PDFs that we were going to look at that, like you say, aren't as amazing, as Joe said, aren't as amazing as a story map. I think Rob Sissons talked about maybe being interested in working on a story map also with folks up there. But in lieu of a story map, we do have some Zoomable PDFs that we were going to take a quick look at here that could be, if not the final answer, at least an interim answer. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And Joe, if you want to show those maps. And
Yeah.
you want to preface this with the fact that they lock up. So
yeah, I was going to say this is the quintessential live demo. Currently, it's even doing it right now. Currently, my Adobe freezes anytime I try and do anything with it. But what I did want to show here is that we can create PDFs in which each of the elements of the PDF can be turned on and off. So in this particular map, you could, if this ever unfreezes, you could, turn off that legend, and then you'd be able to see what's behind the legend, turn off the scale bars. Within here, right now I'm showing jurisdictions, but you could turn off the jurisdictions and then show the core area polygons and the core area CV1 and 2, colors. I only had one probability of success added here, but you would be able to, display your core area polygons and then include under that where the probability of planting success would be. And then, yeah, of course. And then you would be able to, in theory, zoom in to a higher resolution, and the data itself should stay pretty crisp. So this would be a anybody with Adobe Reader that is more functional than mine would be able to turn on and off different data sets and look at the products either at their jurisdiction. Right here I've got sort of Waterton, Glacier, or we could have a version that's CCE scale. So that's just sort of the quick demo of how live demonstrations go wrong.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And really the zoomable PDFs are, like I said, not a story map, but they would be very effective at sharing information. And we wouldn't be able to put tons of layers in there, but certainly the layers that people most need, where their core areas are, where their jurisdiction boundary is, that kind of thing. And so I think because of the breadth of people who we are trying to share this information with, that we need to have a non-GIS option, and that we could start with these PDFs and then think about something grander that we could do if we get the resources we need to do that. Any other comments on that? Okay. My screen does not want to move forward. Okay, just wrapping it up here. Next steps, we're going to compile this limber and whitebark restoration strategy into a summary report. We're going to publish the pilot process paper in the the Journal of Forest Ecology and Management, the special issue for the Hi5 conference. And we also want to complete action plans that prioritize treatments for all jurisdictions in the CCE. Not just, we have the Flathead as an example, but now we need to move forward and do it for others. And I'd just like to thank everybody who participated in this. I could barely fit them all on the screen. We had the pilot strategy technical team, and then the Flathead National Forest Action Plan team, and then the CCE-wide strategy technical team, along with contributions from lots of others, and the Crown Managers Partnership, who sponsored the original meeting and continue to support us as our umbrella organization, Map Monsters, who did the original GIS work on the pilot that Joe has then picked up for the CCE-wide strategy. And we got quite a bit of funding from various resources, the BLM, Parks Canada, Alberta Environment and Parks, and the Forest Service. So thanks to everybody, and that's it. Sorry I went long, but I guess we started late, so I didn't go long. The unit updates did maybe. Okay, that's it. Natalie or Carl, whoever wanna take it away?
Yeah, thank you, Melissa and Joe. That's amazing, the work that you guys have done, as well as everyone else on that list of names you had there. As we were saying, it takes a village to make all this happen, but it takes great leadership too. And Melissa, you provided great leadership on this whole process, and it's very much appreciated.